pleasure for me to introduce Nathaniel Wheelwright. I'm Elvia Melendez Ackerman from the University of Puerto Rico. I'm a plant ecologist. Took my OTS course in 1988. And I would like to have Nathaniel tell us, how long have you been with OTS? And how was that?
Well, first, please call me Nat. That's how most people know me. And I have been with OTS since 1978. I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, and my graduate advisor was Gordon Oriens. Still is my graduate advisor in some way. We just had a lovely long talk, and I still learned so much from him. And it was he who suggested that I go to the tropics. I had done a summer research project up in Alaska and thought I might want to work on parasitic wasps and herbivorous insects on islands in the north. And he said, well, before you make a decision on your dissertation topic, why don't you go down and take an OTS course?
What a wise man.
He was and is a wise man. I think I thought I knew more than I did. In fact, I know that. I had graduated from college a couple of years before, and I had been sent on an expedition to Colombia and Ecuador by my undergraduate ornithology teacher, Charles Sibley, and he wanted me to collect blood samples of birds in Colombia and Ecuador. And so I spent 10 months in the tropics before I ever took an OTS course. But within a week of my OTS course, I realized I knew almost nothing about the tropics, despite having spent 10 months there.
So who were your coordinators in your OTS?
We had a bunch of them. Dave Janis at the University of Miami was, I think, the lead coordinator, and Laura McCarg, his partner. Doyle McKee was our kind of, I even forgot what they were called, sort of assistente, I guess.
TA.
Yeah, TA, sort of a TA. But he was so much more than a TA.
A mentor.
A mentor, and in fact, if I don't return to the topic, I should say that the paper he wrote on coevolution between fruit-eating birds and fruiting plants in the Raven and Ehrlich volume inspired my entire dissertation. So he was a super TA, plus a great guitarist, and taught me many things, as did Dave, as did Mike Singer, who was one of the other people, and Yael Lubin. But we had an amazing cast of faculty. Let's see, Dan Jansen was on it, Gary Hartshorn was on it, Stan Rand was on it, Bert Lee taught us, Bob and Marcy Lawton taught us, Bob Holt, I think, was on that course, John Vandermeer, Gene Stout.
Wow.
I have probably left a few really important people off, Gary Stiles.
All that at a very good price.
Yes, all that at a very good price.
You mentioned before we started taping that you've been a faculty resource for OTS. Tell us about that. Which courses, how has that been, and how does that compare to your first course, the one you took?
Well, none of the courses since I took a course have been as difficult, as rigorous. Nobody gets up as early as we used to. Maybe I've manufactured this and embellished it in my mind, but I think that Doyle McKee and Dave Janis began playing guitar at 4:30 in the morning, every morning, and they gave us a lullaby, and at 5 o'clock breakfast was served, and if you were there 3 minutes late, you missed the boat. And I think we went out in the field at 6 a.m. But it's a little bit like walking to school uphill, coming and going in your memory, but we worked very hard, and we had the freedom to fall asleep during our lectures in the evening because we did work so hard. So I don't know how to compare it with contemporary courses or more.
Did you go to the same field stations?
Well, for many, so I should say that after I took my course, I finished my PhD at the University of Washington. I did a postdoc at the University of Florida. I had a visiting assistant professorship for a couple of years at Cornell. And then I did something that's a little bit unusual for people who've taken OTS courses. I chose a position at a liberal arts college on the coast of Maine without a graduate program. So that was back in 1986. And I had luckily started a long-term research project on lifetime patterns of fruit production and growth rates in male and female trees of a species called Ocotea tenera in the avocado family. And I needed a way to get back to Costa Rica. And I also needed an infusion of the kind of intellectual energy you get when you deal with graduate students. Not to take anything away from my wonderful undergraduate students, but to be challenged by students, to learn from students, was one of the reasons I taught on OTS courses. And that was an opportunity to get me down to Costa Rica, and then I could go up to Monteverde to continue this long-term project. So I'm guessing I've taught on 20 OTS courses,
wow.
Both the English-speaking one and the Spanish-speaking courses as well.
This is the tropical ecology,
yeah,
the fundamentals.
The fundamentals courses and fundamentales. And then in 1997, I think, was the first undergraduate course. And I'd been on the OTS education committee and was for quite a number of years. And so I was pleased to be able to participate in that first undergraduate course. And I think bringing a perspective from an undergraduate institution was useful to the committee.
Perfect.
So in any event, that's given me kind of a perspective over many years on OTS students and OTS courses. I don't know, for differences over the years, it was certainly a lot more natural history focused in the old days. And in more recent years, I think students demanded to know about the relevance of the research to social issues and political issues. So it was a challenge.
That seems to be a theme, actually, within ITVC. You're starting to see people talking about conservation, but conservation with the social sciences influence, and that is very important. What do you teach? What do you teach back in your home institution? And you mentioned before that you teach an OTS like course back in your home institution. What is the OTS model? and how do you transport an OTS like model back to Maine?
Good question. Maine is a long way from Costa Rica,
yes.
But the principles are identical. And I would say I teach not just one OTS course, I teach all OTS courses. And I'll give you an example of one of them. This is probably the most OTS of my OTS courses, but they're all OTS in the sense that they're hands-on, field-based courses. They're not classroom-based courses to the extent that I can avoid that. Fortunately, we live in a rural area of Maine, so it's simple to step out our back door and either walk or run or take a van and be out in some real wilderness. But the most OTS of the OTS courses I teach is something called Advanced Winter Field Ecology. And students sign up for it the way they would sign up for an art history course or a music course or an economics course. But instead of meeting 3 times a week for an hour, I own them all day on Fridays. So we meet at 8:30 in the morning, and this is Maine, and this is winter, and this is 44 degrees latitude. And it may be freezing rain or a blizzard of snow. Doesn't matter. Just like an OTS course.
Like OTS.
Just like OTS. We're going out, and I don't even tell them to check in about whether we're going. We're going. So out we go, and we collect data, break up the group. It's usually 11 or 12 students, and I'll break them into usually 3 groups. Each of them has a short, simple hypothesis to test. It might be the jumping abilities of snow fleas as a function of temperature or fatigue. One of the things we do is we link up with some wildlife biologists in northern Maine, and we track a black bear to her den and anesthetize her and haul this 250-pound animal out of her den, and the students get to hold the cubs while we're measuring the bear. And then that would be a case where they actually talk with applied biologists and learn some of the applications of the theory. And then we come back to the campus at noon. We're totally frozen, and we have an hour to thaw out and eat. And then we meet back at 1 o'clock, and the students work in their groups analyzing data and preparing a research seminar. And then at 4 o'clock, we have 3 research seminars to end the day. So at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they're tired, I'm tired, but we've all learned a lot.
Do you get students, do we have students from your organization coming down to take OTS courses?
Oh, yeah.
Is this something that you recommend to your students, and why? I mean, you teach them how to do science using the OTS model. Why come to the tropics and something with a similar structure?
Well, here's something that's changed definitely since when I took my OTS course. When I was on the course, having spent that year in South America, I was one of the few people among the students on my course who had experience in the tropics, although, as I said, I didn't know much despite all the time. Nowadays, Bowdoin students, by the time they enter Bowdoin, have been to Panama, been to Costa Rica, been to Kenya.
Yes.
I mean, they're so much more worldly. So in a funny way, there's actually less demand for the graduate course, which I think is a shame, but there's more demand for the undergraduate course. So I've sent dozens of students on the undergraduate course, and of the many students I've had who've gone on to graduate school in ecology, my parting words to them as they leave are apply for an NSF graduate fellowship and take an OTS course.
Yeah.
So I have a student actually here at the meeting giving a paper in a symposium who just graduated a couple of years ago, and he's joining the OTS.
So they go into the undergraduate program. Which program? The Costa Rica program, the South Africa program?
Both. And I think both are great. So I tend to direct students, I guess, who've had experience in Latin America. I'll say go to Africa. Those who've been to Africa.
And when they come back, do you see a change? And what is that change?
Yeah, they're serious. They're ready to do solid biology. A lot of them might be an honors thesis student, and many of them will publish their honors theses. So they're definitely well trained. Their eyes have been opened.
Do you feel they're more connected? They network more within their field, or that they write? They're more willing to write.
I don't know. It's hard if they do. It's hard to pin it directly on the OTS course necessarily, because they do get so much other good training, for example, in writing, and they're so connected in so many ways, not even to mention social media connections. But they're definitely changed, and they're smarter and more worldly in a more meaningful sense.
Okay, I want to ask you, so when you started out, what were the questions that were important then? And what are the questions that are important now?
Well, that's an interesting question. There was a paper written about 15 years ago now. I think it was by Steve Vogt, and I may have this wrong, but it was entitled something like Biologically Correct Science. And it's kind of a diatribe against reductionist science and molecular biology and the tyranny of it. And he makes the claim that at no time in the history of science have ideas proceeded so slowly as they are today. And I think that may be a little bit of sour grapes and exaggerated, but he has a point. The questions we were asking in the 70s were really big questions. Community assembly rules, resource partitioning, biogeography, what determined the number of species on the planet and in different habitats. And the approaches people took were much more theoretical, sometimes mathematical, sometimes conceptual, verbal sorts of theories, graphical theories. But definitely it was not a reductionist time. It was also a time, I think, when people felt free to focus on fundamental natural history and ecology. And so those are some changes now. I actually rue a little bit the emphasis on applications of everything. I think it actually may harm the science in the long run. I think there is a phase in your training where you should just indulge yourself in basic natural history and ecology. I think that may actually outlive some of the theories that are popular at a particular time.
Well, how about thinking it this way? Maybe we don't stop doing basic science. We just try to keep in mind the potential applications and the context and the relevance. I think often people feel that they have to do something else, when in reality they can still look at their pollinators, they can still look at their insects, but just keeping in mind that they need to explain to somebody why this would be relevant to them.
Yeah. So that's something that has changed. That sense of responsibility that
Yes.
scientists feel to put their ideas to work. So I'm not saying don't look for applications. Quite the opposite. But you'll see the applications better if you are a really strong naturalist
Yes.
and ecologist.
Yes.
Just as an example of a sort of a fortuitous thing that came out of basic biology in my own research, I did my dissertation up at Monteverde on fruit-eating birds and fruiting plants. And of course, once you see a resplendent quetzal, you have to drop everything and study that. So that's what was one of the species I studied. And watching them over the course of the year feed on lauraceous fruits, members of the avocado family, I realized that they were tracking these different species that were in fruit at different times of the year, and some were high elevation species of plants, some were low elevation species, and this was pulling the birds up and down the mountain. And this was something actually people hadn't realized. They assumed that there was a period during the year where the birds just got quiet and vanished into the woods. But in fact, they were very conspicuous. They were just down in the dry forest.
They're eating.
And they were eating lauraceous fruits. So that basic biological curiosity-driven question led to changes in the design of the reserve that was established in part to protect animals like quetzals. So now corridors go from very low elevation on the Pacific side up and over the divide in Monteverde into the Atlantic lowlands. And of course, bellbirds, another species that I studied in the late 70s, early 80s, is an even more dramatic example of an altitudinal migrant.
So would you say when people think back at your research, do you want to be known by that, what you just say, I am the one responsible for?
No, I think Alexander Scutch even probably figured it out before I did, so I won't claim that, but I certainly provided some data that then people could use to approach fundraisers, or donors rather, and provide an argument for, a quantitative argument for expanding the reserve.
One more thing. So is this what you always wanted to do? When you see yourself now, where you've gone, what you've become?
Well, it's funny, what I've become as a teacher, I suppose, and a researcher. And I think, looking back, I always did want to become a teacher. I always did want to become a naturalist. I always was one, but I didn't think I had what it took to be a university professor. And I remember saying that to Gordon Oriens in graduate school, that I thought I would go and work for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency or some state agency. I just didn't think I was capable of doing good research at that level. Anyway, like as he told me to wait on choosing a dissertation topic, he said, wait till you make it through grad school. You may be not as dumb as you think.